All right, so we will go ahead and get started. I appreciate everybody being on this panel with us and those of us joining in the audience and online, or even those who may see this after the actual event. Um, my name is Dr. Terron Banner. I am the manager of community learning and experience here at the OSU Urban Art Space. I also lecture in the Department of Arts Administration, Education, and Policy at the Arhasa University. My research focus is Black art. I created a course titled Black Art in America, Art and Cultural Policies from Reconstruction to Afrofuturism. So it's very fitting that I am able to join this conversation with, this esteemed guest of panelists. Um, I will give a short introduction of the magazine before I turn the mics over and allow each panelist to introduce themselves. And then we'll get more into the history of the magazine, a little deeper into the panel. But FIYAH Magazine is a quarterly speculative fiction magazine that features stories of Black and diasporic people, and it centers around fiction, science fiction, technology, and diverse stories. So without further ado, I will pass the mic to Maurice.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Maurice Broaddus. I'm a science fiction and fantasy author. I have about, I think 18 or so books out. About 150 short stories have been published. My relationship to FIYAH has been one as a contributor. And I'm also the resident Afrofuturist at the Kepler Institute, as well as a librarian over at the Oaks Academy Middle School.
Amazing. Thank you. And Nelson?
Good to be here. It's hard to follow after Maurice, of course, but I'll do my best. My name is Nelson Rolon. I moved to Columbus about 2.5, 3 years ago. Right now, I teach communications courses at Columbus State Community College. In terms of publication history, I work with FIYAH Literary Magazine since about 2021. I make sure the site's running. I make sure people get their emails and sales questions answered. Any sponsors or advertisements that go into the magazine or on socials run through me. I also edited issue 29 back in January of this year. My publication history, my big work so far is my novelette Saudaji that happened in 2018 with FIYAH actually, and got republished through Lightspeed in 2021. But I've got some other big things in the works. Someday I'll get to 150 publications, certainly.
Amazing. And last but certainly not least, Tonya.
Hi, I am a Jamaican speculative fiction writer based in Florida. I have a number of short stories that have been published in various mediums, podcasts, magazines, and so forth. I have a story that's coming out very soon in the magazine of science. I'm sorry, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And I also have a work that's coming out in MV Media's upcoming it's an Afrofuturist anthology. It's the Space Funk anthology.
Yes.
Yes. So I do have a story coming out in that as well. And I have a number of stories that are coming out in different mediums, for example, on a video game platform that I really can't disclose much about at this time. But as an editor, I've been for about 3 years now, been an acquiring poetry editor at FIYAH Literary Magazine. I basically just assess poems and pick the ones that I think would be a good fit for each publication. And, the managing editor does the final selections. I also recently became the poetry editor at Solarpunk Magazine.
Amazing, amazing. Well, so much knowledge and expertise here. I'm really excited to hop into some of these questions and get your take on it. But before doing so we're talking about Afrofuturism. And a lot of times it can be a vague term, it can be an expansive term. So I want to try and set the stage a little bit before I have you all discuss these things. So Afrofuturism, according to the person who coined it, Mark Derry in 1993, who just happens to be a white critic, right, a white author. And he did this in his essay, Black to the Future, right? So in his essay, how Mark Derry defines it, and I'm going to quote him, so make sure I get this right. It's described as speculative fiction that treats African-American themes and addresses African-American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture, right? So that's the definition by Mark Derry. Derry coined the term, but he did not create it. And I would almost argue that AfriCobra in their 1970 manifesto, 10 in Search of a Nation, described it a little bit better. But still, such variety and such variety in definition and application, I want to ask you all specifically, how do you personally define Afrofuturism in your writing practice, and what does that look like for you? Anyone wants to go first?
Well, for me, Afrofuturism is like the intersection of my art practice and my social practice, right? So it's art through the Black cultural lens. It's that meets technology, meets liberation, meets imagination. I like to think of it in terms of like in fact, I think of my work in terms of like remembering resilience and resistance. I mean, when I boil down my work, it doesn't matter if I'm at the school, if I'm at the Capra, if in my writing, it all comes back to remembering resilience and resistance. And I say that because when I look at Afrofuturism in my writing and in my work, I think of it as like dreaming alongside community, right? So my world building isn't done in a vacuum. It's done, I'm dreaming alongside my neighbors, my fellow Afrofuturists. We're reimagining systems. We're reimagining the world we want to create. And I think ultimately that's what Afrofuturism is us in community constantly asking the question, what is the future that we want to see and how do we build it together?
Definitely agree with that perspective. One of the things that I noticed along my journey as a writer and growing up is that most of the science fiction or speculative fiction that I came across, anything that had to do with futurism, cyberpunk, anything like that, these were writers who were creating universes in which Black people do not exist. And my solution to that was to do the opposite, to create a universe that includes us, a universe in which we have all the same opportunities, the same access to the same technologies, and the same foibles and qualities as anyone else that you would write a story about in any of these genres.
Perfect. I love the definitions, meanings that the other two panelists have given. I'll kind of piggyback on that, of course. I was looking into this today because I have a separate panel tomorrow, like a writing workshop with the urban art space. So it's an Afrofuturist panel. And I'm like, oh, well, what is that? So I looked into it like to establish a definition, and I found what the National Museum of African American History and Culture defines it as, which is Afrofuturism expresses notions of Black identity, agency, and freedom through art, creative works, and activism that envision liberated futures for Black life. So I'm tempted to say they stole this idea from Maurice and just pasted it on their webpage, because that's about what he said earlier. But I think it's wide enough and comprehensive enough to encompass not what I used to think of Black Afrofuturism, which is just like, cool Black people in space kind of things. Like it's so much more diverse than that. I also identify with like what Tonya said about us just not being present in the kinds of fiction that we're reading. And when I thought about what the term meant for myself, it was as simple as saying like I can't escape writing from the Black perspective, right? So I feel comfortable writing Black characters. I've written stories that didn't have Black main characters that I've changed to Black main characters because I could not just fit in their skin otherwise and write an authentic experience otherwise. Or even if I do have non-Black characters, like I feel like they're couched inside of a Black experience, and whether or not that even fits for someone of like another race or culture, that has to play out in my writing. I see if that works or doesn't work, but like that's just my lens as Maurice said, like, you know, that's inescapably my experience. And I'm actually currently reading through Maurice's work, Sea of Stars. And what I liked about that book is that Blackness in that book, or through the Empire of Mungano, is that there's many, many different perspectives in that book. And they present many, many different ideas of like what it means to fit in and contribute to that growing, sprawling society. So I like that idea because I have my perspective of Blackness, which is like a Hispanic youth from Brooklyn, New York. And, you know, I don't expect anyone else to understand that or do that the way I do that. But that is like how I fit in with contributing to whatever my vision of a Black future would be.
Yeah, and those are great points, right? Blackness and Black future is not monolithic. It's expansive, right? So I'm thinking of this quote by Jack Whitten, and I'm going to paraphrase. He says, I can't tell you what's Black in my work, but I know it's there, essentially, right? My sensibility is Black, so therefore, whatever is in my work is Black. So that conversation of like this understanding, or, you know, how I experience the world, the way I see it is Black, but not everybody might be able to relate that specific experience. So to that point, a question I have is, being Black speculative fiction writers, right, intersectional as well, in this space, what are a few things that people may misunderstand about your writing, your experience, or your process in that fictional space?
I guess.
Oh, I'm so
Oh,
sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
no, you go ahead, Tonya.
Okay. I think that one thing that people assume is that as writers, we already have a certain degree of expertise and confidence in what we're doing, and that we, you know, our word is something to be put on a pedestal. And what I have learned over time is that writing is a constant learning experience. I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly learning how to be a better storyteller, constantly learning how to temper what I write based on how the world changes around me. You have to be very observant. You have to be sympathetic and compassionate. And you have to be willing to share some of the most vulnerable things about you with the world.
On a similar vein, in terms of vulnerability, I was thinking earlier about at least one or two emails that I've gotten from people who had like read my story and had really weird stuff to say, like, oh, this is racist. Why are all the Black people like moving to space or more important? Or I was thinking about like random comments I would see on FIYAH on the back end because I work on the website. And I delete them immediately, but you know, some of them are like, you know, why don't you accept white submissions? That's racist or something like that. And so certainly there's like an amount of vulnerability there, like Tonya was saying, trying your best and seeing that not everyone like agrees with it or comprehends it. So when it comes to this question of like being misunderstood in Black speculative spaces, I feel like there's the idea that maybe we spend a lot of time thinking about fighting the power, you know, the white man, and like putting that in our writing purposefully, or like excluding the white man because we personally don't like them. And you know, if I bothered to spend my day thinking like that, I would certainly lose my mind because I'm surrounded by white people in Columbus, Ohio. My wife is white. I'm gonna have a mixed child. You know, it'd be preposterous, but you know, some people are under the impression that like just because we're aware of the systems of whiteness and what that means sociologically and politically and stuff like that, that's, you know, baked into the pie of writing like speculative fiction from a Black lens. And certainly we process that through our writing in certain ways. And the issue I edited, FIYAH issue 29, did deal with like post-colonial issues and diaspora politics and stuff like that. But you know, it's not at the forefront of most people's minds. I don't think that you know, we're like fighting the white patriarchy all the time. It's just like, I've got more immediate concerns in my life, and that the white enemy is there, quote unquote, but that's not, it's an absurd way to think of like the writing process for us.
Yeah, I'm so glad you two went first. Um, yeah, I think it's so I've been at this 20 something, we'll just say 20 something odd years and everything. And I remember definitely coming up, one of the things that frankly I even misunderstood was the whole idea of like what's the responsibility of being the Black artist, especially when so few stories were written by us at the time or for us at the time. And there were so few, as I looked around the scene, there's so few of us even out there. And so then I felt for a while, I like weighted down by this whole, just the idea of what is my responsibility as a Black artist. And I used to anguish over that. And then after a while, just like I sort of settled into, my responsibility is to tell the best stories I can. When all said and done, I need to tell the best stories I can, but also that I'm doing that from a space within community. And so part of that is, and I loved it when you're talking about the vulnerability, and I think about through like the lens of like my own insecurity, even when it comes to what the idea of what even Blackness means. And so I realized over the course of time, I'm navigating the space of my own internal journey of Blackness, as it were, and I am just sort of putting it out there, learning as I go. But it's the whole idea of like, yeah, and I think you keyed off right at the beginning with the whole idea of like, no, it's expansive. This is expansive. It's not a monolith, and we all bring different aspects to the story, to the canon of stories, and I'm just one voice in that, but I'm a voice that's working from this place of love for my community, love for our history, love for our community of stories, and I'm writing from that space. And as long as I'm doing that and doing the best I can, oh yeah, that was my answer to my own misunderstanding.
Yeah, I think the notion of like telling these stories, right? And breaking Blackness out of a narrowly constructed frame of trauma or whatever it's narrowly defined as, right? Because it's evolved, it's changed. It was a ascribed identity, and then it was a described one, right? It was conflated and then inflated. So, it continues to change. And I think we're trying to really make sure that it has its perspective and its depth in a Afro-diasporic sense of unity, right? Blackness in America and Blackness across the world as well. But we're also telling specific stories when it comes to our experiences here and across the diaspora. So Afrofuturism, right, has this, it's this idea that it has the capacity to amplify past, future visions of Black folks, right? And so I think what that means is we've been, historically denied images that are beneficial, images that are fruitful, images that are not stereotypical to a certain extent where we just don't have those ready and present. We can't pull from them, so we have to create them, right? And so I've been thinking about this as almost a nostalgic practice, right? So we are taking these past images and we're creating them fictionally, futuristically in the present, because we can't pull from the past on those things. Badia Ahad Lagarde calls this Afro nostalgia, and I'm very interested in that as kind of a component of Afrofuturism. And so in Afro nostalgia, the creativity that is in the Black imagination or Black nostalgia is less concerned about recovering lost past than it is about evoking or creating ambient associations with Black culture, whether that's sight, sound, taste, smell, so whatever it is, et cetera, right? So it's creating these things. And again, it's breaking Blackness out of this narrowly focused frame of history or traumatic past. So with that being said, and that's kind of long-winded to ask this question, what role does the feeling of nostalgia, and nostalgia meaning the promotion of mental well-being and positive images and imagery. What role does that play, if any, in the creation of your work?
All right, so I was originally born in London, and then I was raised here in America, in Indianapolis. I'm next door. So I've spent most of my life here in Indianapolis. Now my mother, so me, my father, and my brother, we were born in me and my brother were born in London. My father was born in America. My mother was born in Jamaica and is very much still very much Jamaican, as my house currently smells like curry chicken right now. Um, and but when you say when you raise that question, I've been thinking about the fact, like the story I'm working on now. I'm kind of revisiting a universe. I call it's my Airship universe. But one and so it's Afrofuturism. It's steampunk as Afrofuturism is this place I'm playing in. That sort of retro future idea. Um, but one of the reasons that I was drawn to this was this whole idea of a big part of the universe is like reimagining Jamaica as a world superpower, right? And I remember the first time I wrote a story in this world, the nostalgia was this was a love letter to my mom. Like, what does it look like to reimagine Jamaica free of colonialism? What does it look like to reimagine a Jamaica who was in control of all of her resources, and because of those resources, we're able to leapfrog technology in a lot of ways, even in the steampunk world where the rest of the world is stuck with powered by steam, but Jamaica, in control of its resources, runs its technology through solar energy and things like that. Uh, and I think that's part of, hopefully, I think that's getting to the heart of your question, is this idea of nostalgia. And so it's like, oh, wait, so that has a huge impact on clothing. It has impact on music. It has impact on art, has impact on just how folks carry themselves in the world, in the greater world at large. And so there's that whole aspect of it. But then when you talk about the mental space, the mental well-being portion of it, I realized I'm writing from a place of joy because of that. And so it's like, how do I embrace the sense of joy, the sense of play when it comes to my work? I'm writing a love letter to my mom, that playfully just reimagining, and incorporating some of the stories she told me raising when I was growing up. So all these things come together as a part of my story and a part of my work.
Wow. I guess I'll jump in. I'm glad you mentioned like your mother, because I was thinking of this question, and um, you know, very maybe it's a very African American perspective, but like as far as like a connection to like where our parents are from and the great grandparents are from. Um, like I said, I'm from New York, but my mother was born in the Dominican Republic, and she's the closest I have to like any sort of connection to, like let's say our ancestral past. Whether or not that's eating plátanos in the morning or something like that. Like that's just like part of that was part of growing up for me. So like having a direct connection to the past, certainly happens, I think, for a lot of us through our parents. Um, in my own work, my novelette, the premise is that there's a character, Vita, being chased by a bounty hunter, pursued to Earth, and Vita is from Venus, but lands on Earth as part of the process of being chased. And at some point, she has a conversation with Lauco, the bounty hunter chasing her. Um, and a lot of the diaspora from Earth in my stories, like people who fled from like Brazil to go out to the stars to do like astro mining and stuff like that. So the bounty hunter, who doesn't really want to capture the girl, says, you should probably just run to Brazil where your ancestors are from, and maybe I'll join you later, because that's like our ancestral home on Earth, the place where like we only belong because there's not many Black people left on the planet. So there's a scene where Vita's like imagining what it's like to do that, and waking up with the grandmother who wants really strong black coffee in the morning, or like serving shaved ice on the side of the road near the beach, or like praying in front of Qui-Gon Jinn poster because it looks like Jesus if you aren't aware of the Star Wars canon. And so like those are the things that came up for me when we start talking about nostalgia and riffing. And I feel like we do a lot of riffing just inevitably because of distance and time. Um, but also like that's like how we preserve traditions and memes and thoughts and ideas that came from points like we don't directly relate to anymore except genetically or ancestrally. So like I don't think we can really help but be Afrofuturist in our writing. Like we are looking toward the future, just based on what little we know of like what our ancestors are passing through us, and then our parents, and then we're going to pass on as cultural artifacts. It also reminds me of I was reading an interview with N.K. Jemisin and Ezra Klein at the New York Times, and she was talking about the trend towards like multiverses now in fiction. And one way she explained it is like, people don't have a lot of joy right now in the world. So a multiverse is like the way to carry those ideas forward and be optimistic by crafting a universe in which you're happy to be in. I do see riffing as part of that process. Like, let's take what we like, what's survived, and let's move that forward if we can.
One of the things that came to mind as I listened to Maurice and Nelson is something that has been on my mind, it surfaces every now and then. It's the fact that and this is mainly attributed to my mom because she was a very huge science fiction fan. She still is. And so I was introduced to, Doctor Who, Star Wars, Star Trek, Bradbury, Asimov, Niven, because those were the works to which she had access. She did not have access to the works of Black writers. As a Jamaican who is, trying to reach out into a world that goes beyond that small country that doesn't really have access to all these things. I love science and I love science fiction. Not once in my life have I never wanted to be an astronaut. Not because I don't like the science. I love the science. I love cosmology. I love astrophysics, but it never crossed my mind that that could be a possibility. that could be a possibility. And so for a Jamaican who writes about worlds and try to make impossibilities, or you try to share your imagination with the world, for me it's very important to imagine Jamaicans who are not limited by the things to which they currently do not have access. So in my story, Anansi and the Astronaut, it's a Jamaican astronaut. And so little stuff like that, little bits of culture that you just squeeze into these stories because you want to create these possibilities. You want to say, I exist in a universe in which this should not be a foregone conclusion, that this could never happen for me.
Yeah, you mentioned, you all did possibilities. And I think that's at the heart of Afrofuturism, right? These stories, Black Panther, et cetera, they're not revolutionary because they're superheroes or they're fictional, right? They're revolutionary because they created a sense of possibility by seeing these new images. And it took fantasy, it took fiction, it took these technologies to tell that story in different ways, right? And that's really the revolutionary part of it. And I think that's what FIYAH Magazine does. So moving on to that a little bit more, I do want to show, right, the collaboration that we did with FIYAH Magazine, Irrepressible Soul, Urban Art Space. It's a part of Black Future Month. So we have copies here, but big ups. It's an amazing fix. So I'm gonna give a little bit of an explanation, and then I'll pass it to you all. So I'm not gonna do it justice, but I do want to give a short description and get some of the things that I found interesting in the context. So the magazine's mission statement, right? Make sure I get it right. Quote, what does it mean to be Black, and look at intersectional issues of equality through the lens of science fiction and fantasy? Where are those stories in the canon? There is Black excellence out there waiting to be discovered and not tokenized. Octavia Butler is our past, and she's an amazing ancestor, but she should not be our only storyteller. And I love Octavia Butler. We actually have a quote in the Urban Art Space Corridor as a part of the Frequency show. And the quote is, all that you touch, you change, and all that you change changes you. It's above the truth, right? Even going a little bit further, I started thinking about author and activist Adrienne Maree Brown, right? Who was the editor of Octavia's Brood science fiction stories for social justice movements. And in that text, they examine and they look at Octavia Butler's belief that sci-fi and literature, was a transformative force. And, to quote Adrienne Maree Brown, she says, all organizing is science fiction, right? All organizing is science fiction because you're trying to create a world that has never been experienced before. In order to do that, you have to organize, you have to mobilize, et cetera. And I think when I think about FIYAH Magazine, like I see that organizing, I see that mobilizing, and I see it as a transformative force. And the name FIYAH Magazine, right? I think it's very intentional. I'm sure you all can talk a little more about that, but again, I'm thinking back to like my classes and my research, and FIYAH Magazine in 1926, right? The one edition that was published, but it was meant to burn down outdated representation of Black folks, right? That was what it was about. It came out during the new Negro arts movement, or the Harlem Renaissance is kind of what that came from. And you had authors like Wallace Thurman, Zora Neale Hurston, Aaron Douglas, Langston Hughes, on and on, right? And even though it was only one issue, it is still a historic exploration of Blackness. So with that being said, I would love for you all to talk more about the magazine and just talk about how you create a sense of community through the magazine.
I can go first.
Yes, yes.
If you want me to. One of the first things I felt when I first learned about the existence of FIYAH Magazine was excitement. The fact that such a magazine existed for the purpose that they exist. And this is because in my journey as a writer, I've often found that you get a lot of rejection as a Black writer. And the question that was often uppermost in my mind is, when you get a rejection that says, this is not the sort of story we're looking for. Are you rejecting my story because it's not a good story? Or are you rejecting my story because it's a Black story? And it's a very persistent thing that never goes away, and you still experience it to this day. So being a part of FIYAH allows us to create a community, an online community. And when Twitter was a viable social media platform, that's how a lot of us were able to come together, talk to each other, and through our love for FIYAH Magazine, develop camaraderie and really come to the conclusion that, okay, this is a space in which we actually can feel like we belong. And I'm very grateful for that. And I hope that we continue to provide this for people, because when you start feeling like no one wants to read your work because you're Black, at least there's a place that will say, you know what, you're Black, come on over here. We'll read your story. We'll tell you what's wrong with it. We'll tell you what's right with it. We'll publish it if we love it. And the color of your skin has nothing to do with how good or unremarkable a writer you are.
I guess I will add, if I can, but that was pretty good, Tonya. That's it. To complement that, I don't know if it makes sense to say this, but we don't make a lot of money at FIYAH. That's just like something to put out there. We're not like doing this because we're very lucrative and there's millions to be made on the content that we publish. So just very factually, right? Like, the people who are doing the magazine love to do the magazine. And it's, you know, I'm not saying artists need to starve, but it's a level of authenticity that's kind of hard to fake, uh, especially since we're in it just because we're in it, because we want to do it. We're in the trenches and we find work that people want to read and that we think needs to be read. Um, you know, I get a stipend, but it's not paying my rent. Like, I do it because I like to do it, and I meet good people doing it, and I meet great writers doing it. And those great writers, hopefully, if they're not already successful, can move on to do good things with their good work. And we provide a platform for that. You know, it's not any more complicated than that. You know, like Tonya said, um, sucks to think that a reason you can't get published is because of your ethnic background, because of the color of your skin, which somehow, you know, permeates the artwork that you put out there. Inevitably, that's just your lens, as Maurice said, that you see the world through. Um, but you know, everyone who works there really wants to work there, and I don't know how to explain it any more than that. Maurice has contributed to the magazine, so I'm definitely interested in maybe what your lens is on that.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I think my first I had a story in like it's like I think like issue 2, one of the early issues of FIYAH. I had a story, and in fact, that story is actually the one that's going to be reprinted in Space Funk, as a matter of fact. So, I go way back with FIYAH. You know, from the moment it came out, you know, I subscribed, and I subscribed to it like at a couple years at a time. I'm just like, no, I need FIYAH to be around. I need to be around. Um, I'm also the reprint editor over at Apex Magazine, and after a while, the the editor in chief came to me and just like, "Do you read any magazine besides FIYAH out of curiosity? Because it seems like that seemed to be the only story you seem to be reprinting." I'm like, "Okay, that's whatever." Um, so so I'm gonna tell a story here because my relationship with FIYAH is, in terms of community, FIYAH is a community where we can be real with one another. And here's what I mean by that. So I sent in a second story. I mean, after a year, so I sent in a second story to be considered for FIYAH, and then I waited, and then I get this notice back, and it's like, rejected. Reject. Do they know who I am? So I'm Maurice Broaddus. I'm an OG in these spaces. I've been out here in these streets for a minute. I've mentored some of y'all, and I got rejected. And then I took a second look at that story, and I was just like, oh, yeah, this story wasn't ready. Yeah, this story wasn't ready. And folks at FIYAH ain't just gonna publish my grocery list. They're there to do a job, and my story wasn't ready. And they let me know, we love you, but your story wasn't ready. And and I say that to go, the esteem to which I hold FIYAH Magazine and the editorial crew is huge. I mean, obviously, since I was trying to reprint as many as I could over in Apex, but also the fact that they push me as a creative. So my response to that rejection was, oh, no, you don't understand. I'm getting back into FIYAH. Make no mistake. And so my response was to double down. It's like, oh no. In fact, I'm working on the story right now. I'm like, no, I'm getting back into FIYAH because FIYAH is one of those magazines. As a creative, much less a Black creative. You keep the short list of magazines you always want to be published in because that's going to mark your path, your trajectory as a professional. And FIYAH is in my pantheon of those magazines. It's like, no, being in FIYAH is a mark in my career, and I need to get back there. So that's my relationship with FIYAH.
Yeah, hearing you all describe this, right? I think it's so important because Black spaces are important. And Black spaces, I mean, it can be a physical space, that's great, but it can also be mental, it can be virtual, right? And having those spaces to bounce ideas, for self-care, for support, to tell stories, right? To get feedback. Let somebody know you tripping, like, yeah, you tripping right now. It ain't it. But to be able to get that and know it's coming from a place of love, you know what I mean? It is important. So I appreciate about, you all telling that story. Before I go to the next question, I do want to let the guests know that are online. If you have questions, you can throw them in the chat and I can get to them. And when we get to the Q&A, so if you have any, go ahead and load those up. But the next question, the next set of questions, kind of get to the heart and get to know some of the panels a little bit better. So, all right, it's kind of like fire round. What are some of the fantasy sci-fi writers that you all admire the most right now? And do you have any book recommendations?
I'll jump in quick. So Devon Sanders is publisher of FIYAH, and I'm sure he's going to think that I shouted him out just because he's my boss over there. But he released Keenan Masters this year and the Peerless Magic Crew. And what I like about that is it was very much like an ode and like a love letter to the fact that like creativity is magical. And in the book, that is like literally the case. Students are going to like a magical academy there to hone their skills for purposes I won't specify until you read the book, of course. But yeah, I really liked that. You know, the main character likes to rap to himself. He's got a notebook. I told Devon when I was reading it, like this dude is like, he feels like he's got a New York rapper vibe, like, you know, really 80s and 90s, you know, not like ad-libbing like today. You know, I have nothing bad to say against rap today, but like back then, like, you know, you were really trying to craft stories with every lyric and verse. So like I really liked the main character Keenan in that book. I also shout out LD Lewis, who was, you know, really my mentor, helped me get my, you know, my legs when I was first joining FIYAH in 2021. She released a short story in a book. Maurice also had a short story in Out There Screaming, edited by Jordan Peele, very recently released. And she released a story, I think it was called Flicker. And I read that to my wife, and we were in bed, so I thought, oh, it'd be like a good story to read to the baby that, you know, that's in her womb. But it was horrifying. Like I hope my kid does not remember that story. It's definitely something to read, though. It was just good. It was like disturbingly good. So I'll shout out those two stories. Go read them.
Yeah, there's so many writers I admire. Cherie Renee Thomas. She has a short story collection, Nine Bar Blues. Obviously, N.K. Jemisin. I think of her short story collection, How Long Till Black Futures Month. Obviously, I'm pretty prone to short stories. It's my first love. I won't particularly shout out P. Jelly Clark with Ring Shout, and I know he has a new book coming out here fairly soon if it's not out already. And then a book I just read by Zalika Reed Benta, and it's a book called River Mama. And it's a fancy quest novel. With you got these millennials on a quest for the golden bracelet of the Jamaican deity, the River Mama. And this book is just I mentioned my mother and the story she raised me on. This book is like a collection of all of those stories. There's River Mama, there's the Rolon Calf, there's Old Hedge. I mean, there's all these folkloric figures are in this book, and I'm just like, I love this book so much. So that's a book I will be shouting out.
I tend to read a lot of short stories, so maybe more so than novels and novelettes. One novel that I must admit I have not read yet, but I am looking forward to reading is oh my goodness, it's by Suyi Akumbua Davies. It's his latest book. But I remember asking him about it, and he said, imagine Snowpiercer set in the middle of the Atlantic from a Black perspective. And that was all I needed. So I'm looking forward to reading that. Other than that, Ronta Garcia is a Trinidadian author who writes a lot of speculative fiction. She's very, very talented writer. And her story Bishop's Opening, I can't remember if it was in Uncanny or Strange Horizons, but that was one of the first works of hers that I came across, and I really loved it. And she has some books that are coming out in the next few years that I'm really looking forward to.
All right, I'm glad we're recording this. I can go back and get all those names and put it on my reading list. Next question. So what are some trends you see happening currently in publishing or writing, whether it be short fiction or novels? That's the first part. And the second part is there anything you'd like to see more of in fiction?
Oh, I'll jump in because my answer is really short because it answers both questions. And it's novellas. I want to see more novella length markets, more room for the novella length in terms of storytelling. But that I'm also noticing that as a trend, as folks are starting to open up more and more novella markets. I know Apex Books just launched a novella line, and ever since Tor.com first launched their novellas way back when, I mean, just about what, about 8 years ago or so. I mean, we've been seeing more and more novella markets opening up, and magazines starting to accept novella length work, and so I'm glad to see it, but I want to see more of it.
One of the trends that I've been very interested in over the past few years is you could call it web fiction, but it's fiction that's served on mobile apps and mobile devices, because we have a world of so many people who are always moving about and don't really take the time to stand still to say, let me go sit down in front of my PC and read a book, or let me go pick up a book and read it. You know, it's always, I have 5 free minutes while I'm waiting for coffee. Let me see what's on my phone. And so I love that. The thing that I've noticed though with them, and what I wish, is that they would come up with a business model that credits the authors more for the work that they put into these stories. Mm. The writers are not the ones profiting from their stories, and they're not getting the credit they deserve. And so I would love to see something, an ecosystem that actually values the writer as much as it values the money that's coming in from readers and ad revenue.
I would definitely love to talk to you more about that, Tonya, because I'm thinking of platforms like Kindle Vella. I don't know how they're doing nowadays, but that's my first thought. Like, oh yeah, short form content released incredibly fast. I'm sure they attribute authors maybe in some way, but I'm interested in looking into that. In terms of like, I guess, positive moves in publishing that I'm noticing, I see a lot of mermaid content nowadays, which is not exactly like my cup of tea. I've never been terribly interested in it, but certainly mermaids, or even in Tanya's issue 30 that came out of FIYAH, I remember at least 2 stories about, like, you know, oceanic aquatic humanoids being in there. And I'm fairly certain, based on Tanya's email address, which I won't share publicly, she likes mermaids. So I noticed that as a trend. As far as like trends, like I'm really interested in, I think maybe like cozy writing is a term that's come up nowadays, or like cottage core, or the person who exemplifies this, I think, is Travis Baldree, who I think almost won a Hugo for Legends and Lattes this year. That was pretty popular online. Just a simple fantasy story about like a orc trying to run a cafe, essentially. And then a sequel was released that I've also read. Also, like, I like anime a lot, so Frieren Beyond Journey's End was super popular at the beginning of this year. I read the manga like a couple years before then. But you know, we're talking like stories that are just about characters enjoying their lives, almost idyllic country lives. Certainly there's conflict, that's how you tell the story, but not like world-ending stakes, really. It's just like really cool, heartwarming stuff, love stories, adventures and journeys. And I like the trend. I would love to contribute to that in some way when I get the time.
And the River Mama is a Jamaican mermaid figure. So there we go.
which I've also written about. And interestingly enough, Nelson, a slew of the stories that were submitted for that issue were mermaid stories. And I think someone somewhere found out that I like mermaids.
Yes, I guess it's a public secret now.
Great. So we have some questions rolling in. So yeah, we'll get to those in about 2 questions or so. So keep them coming. I'm listening to what y'all talking about, like these trends. I'm thinking about, Afrofuturism. It's about technology, but it's also about materiality, right? So I'm thinking like Spiral, when acrylic paint came out, and that was revolutionary. You can get Kool-Aid colors that are already pre-made, right? I'm thinking like hip hop New York, the mixers and synthesizers when you didn't have instruments, Basquiat with like cardboard and spray paint, right? So one of the things that's always been futuristic about Black folks and Black folks across the diaspora is how we utilize tools, right? And how we reimagine them and how we repurpose them. So I think that's the conversation, right? That's pretty interesting. Okay, 2 more questions and I'll get to the questions from the audience. So, can you tell us more about your recent writing projects? That's one, but I'm thinking like art reflects life and life reflects art, right? So when I ask you that and I ask like what successes have you been celebrating, I don't want to just limit them to writing projects, even though it can be that. So what writing projects have you been working on and what have you been celebrating in life recently?
Let's see, so writing projects and celebrating. So in April, I just had a book come out, Black Panther, T'Challa Declassified. And I don't know if you can see above me or not, but these are my Funko Pop figures, the entirety of the Black Panther collection. So it's not like I'm a fan or anything of Black Panther. In fact, I think I have Black Panther's first appearance almost within reach right now in Fantastic Four, 52, which is over there. But so I've been celebrating the release of that book as a Black nerd dream come true. And then in terms of my writing practice, Sweep of Stars came out, and I have its sequel, Breath of Oblivion, will be coming out in November. And then the final book, which I'm just now starting to work on as of today, A City Dreaming, and that should be out next year. And a lot of ways, and that's straight Afrofuturism, like I said, that intersection of my writing and my art practice, because it reimagines the community organizing work that I do at the Kepler Institute, and just reimagining that as an intergalactic community. And then what does that look like in terms of creating and maintaining a culture of our own? And what does it look like to have to defend that culture? And then lastly, I have I have a middle grade novel coming out, I believe next year, called Stomping on the Ave, which is a historical middle grade novel. And it takes place on Indiana Avenue during its heyday. And a lot of people don't realize that Indianapolis was the Black cultural mecca just behind Harlem for a long time. And so I wanted to write a story to highlight and celebrate that. And so yes, and then I guess lastly, things I've been celebrating. I'm about ready to sign a new book deal. That's not public knowledge yet, so I can't say much about it. But just trust me that I am celebrating this next book deal. So.
I am currently working on, this is my fairly biggest project at the moment. It's a collection of short stories and novelettes. And I just describe it as a collection of genre-bending short stories featuring unapologetic and bold Black women, blazing trails and wreaking havoc across time, space, and the multiverse. So it seems like a very haphazard collection, but at the same time, it has a very common thread running through it. So I think I'll be able to pull it together eventually. In the meantime, I am very happy about the next issue of SF&F, Science Fiction Fantasy Magazine, because that's where my next story is coming out. And I'm really overjoyed about that because ever since I was a child, I've been reading that magazine and wanting to be published alongside those authors. So that makes me very happy.
Very nice. I look forward to reading your collection, Tonya. As far as successes, so Saudaji, my novelette's really the only publication I've had since 2018, and then the republishing in 2021. I wrote like a novel-length fan fiction of Tenchi Muyo, which I'm too ashamed to like show people, but that lives somewhere online. But that's probably like my first novel-length work ever, and there's a very small amount of people who need to read that, and that's it. We have I have a couple things in the pipeline. One is like about a giant cat kaiju, which Tanya might have read in one of our like Carbon Collective meetings. But it's absurd. I needed it to be absurd. It's loosely based on like Godzilla movies, but it's just a giant cat. So I would like to submit that soon, very soon, to a couple publishers if I can. And I've been working on another project for years now, but it's like it was based on a dream. It's just like a humble couple in Brooklyn that owns like a hobby shop that sells like card games and tabletop games and stuff. So like they're nerds in the 2010s, roughly when I was like coming of age and really growing into myself and nerd culture and fandom. And that's probably going to be novella length. I'd love to release that, or at least start pitching that to agents like within a couple of months. Because my other success should be late August. I'll be having my first child, and I don't imagine I'll have a lot of room to do writing for the first month or two while that's happening. Probably won't get much sleep. Maybe I'll write some really great delusional stuff in that time. But that's roughly what my life's looking like right now.
I hate to break it to you, but that's in the next 18 years of your life is probably going to sound like that.
Yeah, I thought it was cute when he said, "Oh, the next month or two." Like, really, month or two? Okay.
I'll come to you for advice, Maurice, please.
But congrats, all of you on that. Those are all major. So yeah, congratulations. This last question, I'm going to wrap in one of the audience questions into it. So what advice do you have for writers that you would have liked to have had when you first started out? That's one. And then the second part, any world building tips?
I think one of the first pieces of advice that I wish I had gotten when I was starting out as a writer was, and I still have to remind myself of this all the time, it's try your very best to remain in the present. And what I mean by this is focus on your work, focus on the story, focus on craft. You're not writing a story that's going to win a Nebula Award next year. You're writing a story about a heroine who's doing X, Y, or Z. Focus on that. Because once you start thinking about what you hope that work will accomplish once it's out of your hands, you kind of lose control of the art form itself. And I'm so sorry. What was the other question?
Any world building tips?
World building tips. I would normally, world building, I try my very best to just close my eyes and picture what that particular area would look like. So, if I am saying, for example, there is a video game I'm currently playing called FIYAH. I'm very obsessed with it. It's a cozy game, but it has a very interesting lore about humans who lived on this planet and then their civilization ended. And this is thousands of years later, they start reappearing in this world. And what I love about it is that now you have to approach a story from the context of, this is no longer humanity's world. This is no longer a culture controlled by humans. And there are other intelligent beings living on this planet. You have to learn to immerse yourself in their culture while trying to find out what on earth happened to your culture and why it ended. And, you know, so you have a very strict, you know, like belief systems. What do they believe in? What do they frown upon? What kind of flora and fauna you'd encounter on a planet like this? It's a planet with 2 moons. Does it have daylight or sunlight? Nighttime? Because if it has 2 suns or 2 moons, you're not going to have the day-night cycle that we're used to. So you consider all these mechanics and then you just go with it.
Yeah. So for the first question, advice I wish I would have gotten, find a mentor. So like I teach at a middle school, and we got out at the beginning of June. And so for the last month, I've actually, since I run a creative writing program there, I let some of my creative writing students, they get to shadow me over the summer. And so, you know, so they shadow me while I'm doing my writing practice. They shadow me if I go to different meetings, or they get to eavesdrop on conversations when I have friends come by, just so they can see the life. This is the life of being a writer. And so, in fact, it's funny because like Cadwell Turnbull happened to be in town, and so he came over and hung out. And a couple of my mentees were there, and they were, you know, just eavesdropping in the background, and then have them introduce themselves and talk about their work and everything. And even Cadwell turned to me and was just like, how great would it have been if when we were at their age, we had like, I mean, not to sound so weird, if we had like people like us come into our lives just to walk with us on this journey. So that's the advice I think I would do. As early as you can, find a mentor. You know, local artists, you know, all the folks who come through my area, just the whole idea, because we do this all in community. Right, we don't have to be out there toiling away in the basement all by ourselves. So we can do this work in community. So the importance of finding a mentor, I can never overstate that. In terms of world building tips, I like to remind people. In fact, I just taught this to the middle schoolers, as a matter of fact, in terms of world building. We create with a blank page. And what that means is with a blank page, anything is possible. Like in Sweep of Stars, I can have starships powered by jazz music. Why? Because it's my blank page, and I can do what I want, right? And so as far as organizing your organizing tips, I always say start with the big idea and sort of work your way down. So there's this one big idea you're trying to interrogate. This one idea that's sort of the crux of your world. It doesn't matter what it is. Like in my steampunk world, it was like America lost the Revolutionary War and remains a colony of England. All right, now with that in mind, let me build out what this world could look like. And then I divide it basically there are 3 major things I think about. One is, what is the physicality of the world? 2, what is the social fabric of the world? You know, what do the cultures look like? And then lastly, technology. What is the technology? And I'll say technology / magic, because I can use them kind of interchangeably, because they sort of play the same role in world building. So what does the level of technology or magic look like in your world? And so those are the big areas that I didn't start having folks just drill down on after that.
All right. I'll piggyback for a moment on the emphasis of like having mentors, because we kind of do this intuitively. Like I used to draw a lot, and you know, you just pick up a comic book. When I was growing up, I really liked Michael Turner, who passed away at some point, but like drew amazingly. Or like even How to Draw the Marvel Way. Like my uncle had that in his house, and I would copy that book and learn from that. But like we do that intuitively. It's probably easier and faster results because of like drawing and illustration. But with writing, we kind of do the same thing. And the difference really is that having that in-person mentor, you know, they're literally there to help you when you're demotivated. It's not good enough to just like watch a cool movie and be inspired, right? If you know the filmmaker, they can help you through your issues. So certainly, especially now that I'm like a professor at a college, like I help people with writing all the time, and then stuff beyond just schoolwork. You know, students have lives and things that they struggle through, and you know, it's invaluable to have like, you know, someone to literally help you when the chips are down or you're feeling insecure. So yeah, definitely can't overstate the value of mentorship. My uncle was that person for me in the creative arts. You know, I just relied on him for that, and I'm definitely grateful for that. And I probably wouldn't be nearly as cool as I am without him. In terms of writing advice, certainly, you know, all of what Tonya said is true. It's very easy to get distracted into not writing because of things like comparing yourself to other people. Nowadays, you know, looking on social media and seeing how little you've published compared to someone who's publishing every year, every 2 years, or in a magazine every 60 days. Nitpicking about, you know, how big my screen is, or is my keyboard set up right, or is my chair comfortable enough, or do I need another pen or a new notebook because I already wrote this notebook already. Like, it's very easy for me to like obsess over like stupid details, and then just not write anything. And like Tonya said, like there's a liberating feeling that comes with just personalizing your writing. Like, this doesn't need to be shown to anybody, right? I can write the worst draft in the world, but you do have to be like your biggest fan. Like, just fall in love with the world you're working on, and no one else has to see that, right? Maybe that's like the thing to offload from your brain in order to start, right? You have no pressure to do well. Writing is not incredibly lucrative for 99% of the people who get into it. So don't worry about it. You know, it's great to want to write, and just do that genuinely without the pressure of looking at other people and comparing yourself to them. Certainly, Maurice is, I think, in the bracket of people who have made a career of writing, and to some degree, we all have. And then obviously, there's like considerations about what's appropriate or not appropriate, or what is your editor going to say, or what is the marketing going to be around your book. But starting out, like, I think that stops a lot of people. Like, a lot of the things we get into our heads that psych ourselves out of writing, I think, is to our detriment. And to a degree, like, you need to learn how to empathize with people. You need to learn how to interact in the world and build communities. And then I would say you go from like being a amateur writer to a great writer, because you're out there understanding the world and trying to participate and contribute to it. But if you're just putting your pen to that blank page for the first time, yes, have a spaceship powered by jazz. Why not? If you throw the idea out, no one ever needs to know it existed in the first place. And really, you know, focusing on the now. There's no better time to be writing. I know personally, I've also like tried getting rid of my socials for the most part and not listening to music or doing anything but writing. But that's because I think I'm just easily distracted. So there are strategies to help individuals. For me, it's just like divesting myself of things on the internet or music I'm tempted to play, because I can't toggle well. So I just try to do one thing at a time. And if that needs to be writing without music for an hour, I can do that. But that's going to be a little different for each and every person.
Okay. So we have one more question, and then I will allow parents that have any closing thoughts or closing statements. This one's a little bit longer, so make sure I read this right. When writing folklore and myths in your work, how much room do you leave for imagination? I find that a lot of European myths and folklores are preserved, but I struggle to find some from my background. I'm African, as most of it is oral and changes, etc. If I need to read that again, I can, let me know.
I think that if you're looking for work that, because I do know that, yes, a lot of the African mythos and lore are have been lost to us, especially those of us from the diaspora, because we were effectively severed from that part of us when by the transatlantic slave trade. But and even to a lot of, there's so many African languages in all the different countries that people who write and have access to writing don't necessarily have access to the old stories, or they're written in languages that are lost. And so it can be difficult, but there is such a huge pantheon of stories within the African culture that what has been lost and what's still there are both immeasurable. I don't want to mispronounce his name, but he's frequently known online as Pen Prince, Donald Ogunawuchi.
Ogunachobwe, yeah.
Okay. He coined the term Afropantheology. And I really like that because there is a cadre of African writers who are trying their best to write those mythos into modern science fiction and speculative fiction. And so it's a matter of finding those writers, finding their stories, but also keeping in mind that, yes, a great deal has already been lost and may never be recovered.
I mean, I end up using quite a bit of folklore in my work. Again, a lot of I can think of, like, I've written 2 stories involving the River Mama, for example, and then one with a Rolon calf. And in my current project, I'm writing. There's a story that was told called about a figure named Three-Fingered Jack, and so there's a lot of Jamaican folklore that I end up incorporating into some of my work. And I do, it's like it's a interesting thing because I'm balancing out, the stories that my mother told me, and what I keep in mind is, because she would definitely keep hammering this point home, is this is how we pass our culture along. This is how we hand it from one generation to the next. And so I think of it as an inheritance of stories. And so what do I do with that inheritance? So part of it is, I'm preserving that story, but I'm also, doing my tweaks as I need to thematically tie it into the actual rest of the work of what I'm trying to do. So I have to allow myself a certain amount of creative freedom to do what I need to do with the story, which actually is what griots do, as it turns out. And so I'm just very conscious of that. No matter where I'm finding the folklore, it's even American stories, American folklore that my parents or my grandparents would tell me. How do I mine those stories? It's all the same process. It's about finding the stories, being true to the stories, true to the heart of the stories, but then also going, hey, you know what? I'm a storyteller. I need to do what I do with these stories and add my own embellishments, my own voice, my own tweaks to it to sort of personalize those stories to make it in some ways, make it mine.
I won't add much. I think I'm certainly at a disadvantage in that my family was much more heavily Christian. So anything going too far back ancestrally is just kind of disregarded as like, just anathema, right? It's just not part of the Christian canon, especially if you're like a fundamentalist Christian or an evangelical. So those things are kind of like just closed off entirely to me. But the most I would say is, I play a video game sometimes called Smite, and it's just like gods fighting each other of different pantheons. So you have Greek pantheons, and like New Orleans has a few gods, voodoo gods in the game. So for me, it's like, well, if they can like make money and profitize that kind of history for some people, like speaking as someone who doesn't have that in their toolkit necessarily, if some video game company in Georgia can do it, I think like we all have the ability and opportunity to do that. Like you said, Maurice, part of the storytelling is certainly telling it not the same way every time, because you just can't physically literally do that. I imagine it's playing like, that game of telephone, right? The person tells you the story and then you tell the next story and then you tell the next story, and it resembles the original story in some way, but in a lot of ways it does not. So, speaking with what little experience I have, I would imagine that it's probably fine to be a little apprehensive. But the stories that we're hearing are probably not original in the sense that we think they are, just because of so many centuries have passed. So don't be afraid to do better than Smite does, because I'm sure you will.
Okay, so we are finished with questions. I want to give each one of you the opportunity for any closing thoughts or closing words before we end.
If I were to have any closing words, it would be simply this. And this is something that I say all the time. And it is that imagining is far more entertaining than knowing. We may not have all the answers. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know where our species is going or whether we'll survive the next 100 years. But we can imagine infinite possibilities. And that's why we're here as writers and storytellers, is to bring those stories to everyone and try to manifest a future in which our entire civilization, our species can thrive, or at the very least survive.
Yeah, I'm reminded of something that Tanana Reeve Dew said, and she's, I was the act of dreaming of ourselves with a future is the first act of resistance. And I always keep that in mind that as Afrofuturists, we have the opportunities to write characters that embody new principles, new ways of being. We can write these stories of joy and thriving, these stories of perseverance, and just these visions of a different and a better future. And I just think just like, again, the sacred responsibility that encapsulates also, but just the idea that we can create these visions and paint pictures of possibilities, and then those visions, those possibilities can actually inspire people and inspire the work being done now, so that as we cast these visions of the future, we inspire people to go, hey, what does it look like for us to take those first steps now to create that future of that vision? So yeah, that's why Afrofuturism is at the core of my practice.
I don't think I have anything profound, but like I shared, I'm having a daughter by the end of August, and that was a big leap of faith for me, spiritually, and some of what Tonya said resonates. People think the world is ending tomorrow, possibly all the time. I don't know how long we've been thinking the world is ending, but if it wasn't Y2K, it was Nostradamus, it was 2016 election, it's might be 2024 election, might be Ukraine, might be China and the South China Sea and Taiwan, but not being afraid to continue to write and love and persist and create. um, as Maurice said, that's defiance in and of itself, right? That is the astrofuture Afrofuturism. It is the Afrofuturism, and we, it's something we write, but it's also something we embody, and it's something that we kind of inevitably live out, in our day to day, just by continuing to write and create, and having the faith to go forward, even when the future kind of looks like mud right now. But I think we're going to be okay, and as the other panelists have shared, um, I think we're going to be okay. That's what, for me, Afrofuturism boils down to. Like, you're going to make it, and we've been doing that. We've been riffing, we've been adapting and evolving, and we're going to continue to do that. So, for all the writers out there, get to writing.
Yep, and I'll piggyback off that for the final closing thought. Black folks are in the future, right? And I'm going to quote Tupac, who I'm going to say was Afrofuturistic. But he to the artists, to the writers, to the scholars, to the researchers out there, Tupac said, "I may not change the world, right? But I can spark the brain that will change the world." So you never know what your art may do. And we exist in the future. So thanks to all the panelists. Thanks for all who attended virtually and in person. And yeah, we look forward to more conversations. Peace,
All
y'all.
right.
All right, peace now.
Great talking to you.
It was a real pleasure.